So without further ado, let's dive into the next session, which is session 13, a fireside chat on the topic, Decoding the Black Box, Explainable and Trustworthy AI. Well, as we move into the future, we must embrace AI and develop trust in the technology. But to trust the technology, we have to be able to better comprehend techniques such as deep learning and make it accountable to the end user. Let us hear views on why understanding the reasoning behind AI decisions is a growing priority. Speaking on the topic, we have with us Beena Ammanath, Executive Director of the Global Deloitte AI Institute, and she leads Trustworthy and Ethical Technology at Deloitte. She's the author of Trustworthy AI, which helps businesses navigate trust and ethics in AI. Chairing this chat will be Sangeeta Gupta, Senior Vice President, NASSCOM. It's a pleasure to have both of you join us this evening, and over to you, Sangeeta.
Thank you so much, Justin, and Beena, welcome to this NASSCOM XperienceAI Summit. We're really delighted that you can join us today. XperienceAI Summit is really the platform for NASSCOM to bring all the AI stakeholders at one place, and you're really somebody that the audience is looking forward to hear today. I want to start, with a more personal question, Beena, on what got you started on this whole journey on explainable and trustworthy AI. It's not something that people choose as a first step, right? So I'd love to hear what was your personal motivation to move on this journey?
Sangeeta, firstly, thank you so much for having me, and I am delighted to speak to this audience. And that's a great question to start with, because you don't see many technologists, right, trained engineers or data scientists really talking passionately about this topic. But that's exactly why I feel it's important for technologists to be more actively involved. So I'm a computer scientist by training, and I've built data analytics. Have been in that whole journey from data to BI, and now with AI. And as AI started becoming real, now this is something I studied in college, Sangeeta, and at that time, we didn't have access to computer data to do anything with it except talk about it in theory, right? And now it's happening in our own lifetime. Things are getting real. And as I was setting up my first AI team, I saw that I was not, it was my team, but I was mostly getting more men, as the candidates, and my first few hires were men. So the first alert sign went on, why am I, in this AI team that I'm setting up, and I'm the only woman? And then the second time, once I started focusing and making sure that we got more, gender diversity into the team, I realized we didn't have enough people of color. We didn't have people from different geographic backgrounds. And the work we're doing with AI is so tied to human intelligence. At the same time, the conversation on bias had started bubbling up. And I realized you need to think about diversity. And I'm a huge, huge technology optimist. I realize that if we don't start thinking about the negative impacts of technology up front, if we don't think about the ways AI could go wrong, AI will not reach its full potential. I believe that AI can make all of our lives better. AI can really, really, take humanity to that next level. But for it to be that next level, we have to address those negative impacts proactively, right? So that's how, I got more interested in this topic. And I really believe for this specific technology to succeed, we have to think about the negative impacts. And I don't see many technologists speaking about it. There are many people from a marketing background, or legal background, or philosophical background, and which tends to get really abstract, right? You need to know the capabilities of AI so that then what are the ways it could go wrong. So I think that it needs that, even technologists to be part of the conversation for us to actually solve for it.
I think that's a great perspective, Beena, because, having started with your own personal journey, you've seen how this is so important to what we are building out. I mean, it's very important for the enterprise, it's important for countries, it's important for society. And clearly, I think that is the thinking we need to drive. Sometimes, as NASSCOM, when we're advocating responsible AI or trust in technologies, you just see people blanking up, right? So there's that kind of, yeah, it's good, but I really don't understand what it means. So I think getting people to even understand how do you make this real is really key. And you're doing a phenomenal job, making that happen. Meena, you mentioned this part about, AI is real. And I think the theme of this event is how do you make AI real? Because at least from an India context, we see a lot of conversations about AI, the potential of AI. We've seen a number of implementations of AI, but it's still very siloed implementations at a functional use case level. As a technologist, how do you think AI for a developing country like India can follow a process, both at an enterprise as well as at a government level? Because we necessarily have not seen what are the 2 or 3 key things that we should be focusing on. Yes, there's conversation on data, there's conversation on policy, but it's just not coming together enough. So we'd love to get your perspectives on how do we think about making AI more real for India?
That's a great question. I think if it's like everything else that we do in India, right? If we can solve it for India, it can be solved anywhere, right? One thing to start with is I don't think a top-down approach really is going to work. And that's why you've seen a lot of silos, right? The grassroots level efforts happening. And so the timing is actually right now to push that top down, right? The playbooks, what companies are learning, what enterprises are learning, and bring those best practices in and scale it out across. And NASSCOM has such a huge role to play, because if you see something succeeding at an enterprise, how do you make sure that that information, that knowledge is available not only to other large enterprises, but to startups and to governments, so that governments can regulate or govern it, right? So I think NASSCOM, an organization like NASSCOM, has to be that central axis that's kind of connected to that entire ecosystem and becomes that knowledge sharer. Because, we still don't have textbooks, that is pushing out information on all the ways that AI can be used and scaled out. And that's where NASSCOM actually comes into play. And this is a flux period that we are living in. I guarantee you that in another 10 years, we're going to see much more, not only regulations and structured approach, but also more consortiums or events happening on this, which is about taking it to that next level. So the timing at this flux timing, it is crucial for an organization like NASSCOM to step up and bring together everybody.
No, I think very, very, very well said, Beena. And I think as NASSCOM, that's really our focus with, awards, recognitions, reports, events. How do we figure and discover what are these best practices, what's working, and how do you share that with the wider community? Because like you rightly said, everybody's in a flux, and it's only in that flux that we can figure out and share. And the more we share, the more we learn, really. So I want to come back to the theme of the event, of the session, which is really about explainable and trustworthy AI and why that really matters. Yeah. But just to get started, right? I mean, how do you think about differentiating explainable AI from trustworthy AI to responsible AI to ethics in AI? They all sound somewhat similar, but do you see them as really different?
Yes, in fact, I do. And, I like to think of it as trustworthy AI, because that for me means AI has been adopted, has been accepted. If you can trust a system, then, you've accepted it and you can scale it out. And I think of responsible AI, explainable AI as dimensions within, the broader umbrella of trustworthy AI. And ethics is absolutely a part of it. What's happened so far, Sangeeta, as there's been a lot of talk about ethics and bias. And what that happens is it creates a fuzzy concept. Exactly. And, when you are a creator of an AI tool, having a structured approach to, is the only way you can solve for it. And by no means do I think that we have all the dimensions of trustworthy AI identified. But if we have, a few dimensions to start with, it at least gives us a way to get to a solution. There is something that organizations, that individuals can do. So, when I think about trustworthy AI, I can rattle off some of the dimensions. One is, of course, explainability. And explainability, we all have a vague understanding of what that means. It's used in the context of transparency and black box, but really it is much more nuanced than that. A lot of what, to start with, when you talk about trustworthy AI or AI ethics, it's the answer is always going to be, it depends, because it depends on the use case, right? Explainability may be necessary for certain use cases. It may not be as important for certain use cases, right? So first step is to identify which are the dimensions that's important. So and then explainability, if you go down to how do you solve for it, it is not a one size fits all again. The way you explain how the algorithm works to the data scientists or the engineering teams is going to be very different than how you explain the same thing to your CEO or board members or to other stakeholders, right? So I think, once you define what level of explainability is needed, you need to identify who are the stakeholders that it needs to be explained to, both internal and external. It needs to be explained, to your CEO, board members, but it also needs to be explained to your consumers or to the government, right? So how you explain is the next step. But once you have a structure to it, Sangeeta, then you can actually solve for it. And then enterprises the creators of these tools, the users of these solutions can ask the right questions to actually then make progress on it.
Yeah, I think you have to think about it at a broader level rather than, narrow it down to ethics. And like you said, right, it sounds nice, it's fuzzy, but you really don't know how to operationalize that. And that really is my next question, Beena, which is, we recently did a short survey on a self-assessment on responsible AI. And, we had kind of asked all the right questions, which were linked to all the principles for responsible AI. And almost 80% of the participants who responded to that survey seemed to feature in the leader quadrant, right? Which is highly unlikely, right? So do enterprises or teams within those enterprises have a much higher self-assessment of their trustworthy AI or responsible AI maturity than what the reality is? And if yes, then what corrective action do they need to take so that their self-assessment is much more accurate than what they may be thinking they have, right? So
yeah, that's a great question, and it actually, is because there is no structure to it, right? Because ethics or responsible AI, or even trustworthy AI, can be considered this big concept, that people talk about. So I think you have to get down into the weeds to ask the right level of questions, right? Say you are using facial recognition technology, right? Of course, we've all heard about the bias that exists in facial recognition technology, and it is impossible for you know this as well as me, that it is impossible for AI to be completely unbiased. So how do we solve for it, right? By setting metrics. What level of bias is acceptable and what is not acceptable, right? If you're using facial recognition technology in a law enforcement scenario, in a scenario where you are tagging somebody as a criminal based on, their facial recognition, right? In that case, bias, is really, you have to go deep into making sure that it is as unbiased as possible. But if it is being used, and these are both the real use cases, right? Facial recognition technology is being used to identify kidnapping victims or human trafficking victims, right? And both are used in very similar setting by using it at traffic lights, right? You can use that same technology to flag somebody as a criminal, but you could also use that same technology to identify a kidnapping victim or a human trafficking victim. And so in the second scenario, when you're identifying these victims and there is bias, maybe you are able to identify only 60%. Or say 30%, like very less, but still it is better than not using that technology. So is that acceptable? Or you would rather, not rescue in that 30% of the victims, right? So at some point, humans have to weigh in and set the metrics and say, in this scenario, this level of bias is acceptable. In this scenario, it's not acceptable. Right? If we have metrics, you can measure for it. And AI is one of those cases where, you have to go down into the weeds to be able to solve for it.
So in some ways, and that's a great point you've raised, Beena, in some ways what you're suggesting is that as you build AI, and obviously you take all the principles of trustworthy AI into your development process, but you also test it for biases proactively, right? As opposed to a post-factor scenario that we seem to be doing today, right? We go through a scenario and then we say, oh, this has bias, so we pull back that technology. Is that what you're really recommending?
No, what I'm recommending is think about it before you even start the project. Like
Yeah.
it's a simple question. What are the ways this could go wrong, right? The engineers, the scientists who are developing are deep into the problem. So and thinking about what are the ways it could go wrong can help you proactively fix it. And in some scenarios, bias may not even be an issue, right? If you're using AI to predict a aircraft engine failure, right? In an IoT scenario, bias doesn't even come into play, right? But if you're using human data, then bias is a crucial factor. But then you have to sit back and think, okay, we are going to have biased data. We're going to, our algorithms are going to be biased, but what is the impact on the outcome? Is that bias acceptable or not, right? So I think it is very important to have that kind of discussion right from the ideation time, so that we don't end up in a scenario like Jurassic Park, right? Where just because your scientists or researchers they did without thinking of the ways it could go wrong. So I think it is time for us as technologists, especially, to take a little bit of ownership and think, not just focus on the ROI and all the cool things this new app can do, but think proactively about what are the ways this could go wrong. Who is it leaving behind? Is it driving more inequality? Is it putting more people, under psychological harm, right? So I think asking those questions as part of your project planning phase is a great way to get started, because today those questions don't get considered, right? Because we are trying to think of it as this very high level. But it is at that project level that you really need to think about and then address it.
So as you think about what the technology can do for you, think also what it can harm, right? And do that more proactively as opposed to a post-factor environment that we've seen. But just building on that question, right? And since a lot of AI startups exist in India, and many of them, some are building on societal use cases, some are building enterprise use cases. Every time, we are trying to educate them on bias and trust and ethics, they kind of get overwhelmed, right? And you've got 101 problems to solve, right? And now don't create another one, right? So what is the simplest way to get them without, giving tons of documents to them? What would be some easy ways to really help them understand what are simple ways to get started that they could actually make happen as they start on their AI journey? So.
Yeah, I think the easiest way is to have a checklist of questions they can ask. Mm-hmm. And you should make that checklist depending on different functions or industries or, domain, right? Yeah. So that it is a checklist of questions that they can ask. But I think every project management tool, no matter what you use, should have a question on, just like you have a column always on ROI, the value that this, solution can bring, there should be a column on negative impacts or ethical risks or, the risks that you are taking on, because it can eventually, if they've not addressed it, it can cause, that startup to shut down. There can be negative brand damage. There can be damage, to other human beings. And no startup really wants to do it. I don't know of a single technologist who is saying, oh, I want to do this bad thing that, and that's what I'm going to do. That's not a startup mentality. That's not an enterprise mentality. We have criminals for that who will use these technologies negatively anyway. So I think it is proactively, having a set of questions that they can go through as a checklist, right? Making that easily available is a great way to start, and then changing the project management methodology to include some of the negative risks, right? Yeah. Proactively. And Sangeeta, I'm not saying you should spend hours, but even if you spend, half an hour or 10%, thinking about the ways this solution can go wrong is much better than not thinking about it.
No, I agree.
Because once you once
the
you
checklist
think
is a
about
great
it,
idea, right? Because
yeah,
the minute it's customized for me, it's not a generic document I'm throwing at them, right? If it is about
yes,
HR, for recruitment, AI for recruitment,
yes,
what are the 5 questions that I should be thinking about? So I
yes.
think it's really about that use case and what are the right questions in that use case. And I think that's a great input, Beena, that, at least as NASSCOM, we'll try and see how we can build up on that. I know we are in the last 5 minutes and I have a couple of audience questions, Beena, that I wanted to ask you. The first one is really about, is trustworthy AI, responsible AI, does it require a regulatory framework? And do you see that being more effective than a self-regulatory framework? And, based on your experience of different countries, how do you see what can be a recommended approach for India?
Yeah, that's another great question, because for too long we've been talking about regulation as one size fits all for AI. And I don't think that's true. I think at a higher level, the regulations are going to be very country specific, region specific. And, think about it as 2 buckets, like regulations that already exist for a industry that you're trying to solve for, right? Like if you are building a healthcare app, there are regulations that already exist, right? So it is about thinking about the impact of AI on that industry and extending, the existing regulations, right? It doesn't have to be a brand new regulation. It's not an AI regulation for healthcare. It is, regulation that exists, say, for patient diagnosis, extended to include the AI impact, right? So that's one category. The other category is the new industries that's been created by AI, completely new use cases where there is no regulation. Again, it will depend on the industry and the use case and not at a high level. And it will be as nuanced. I mean, think of something as simple as speed limits, Sangeeta. Speed limits vary across the world, right? Depending on where you live and where you're driving, the speed limits are going to be different. It's the same. It is going to be how the AI is used to solve what problem. The regulations are going to be around that problem set.
I think that's a good way to think about the problem, to think about the issue, Beena, which is really don't start creating new regulations, right? Regulations exist across sectors. And within those regulations, how do you think about biases, trust, ethics, responsible AI, right? Rather than creating another set of horizontal laws that may not even be applicable, even if you're thinking at a country level, right? And I think that often is a debate we have that, every technology does not require a separate law, because technology and financial services should be governed by the financial services laws as opposed to another technology related law. We'll come to the last question, Beena. This is a bit of a trick question. I don't know what to call it, but, I think the question is really, do you see a black swan event kind of scenario happening that will make trustworthy AI, responsible AI more real? Just as an example, the pandemic and the accelerated digitization made cybersecurity and cloud more real. If there was a scenario like this, what do you think would be that, maybe that moment that can make this much more a boardroom or the real, and not just a good to have discussion, but a must discussion?
Yes, as we are seeing more awareness rising about the risk associated with not thinking about trustworthy AI, there is, I'm definitely seeing this becoming a boardroom discussion, even in the last 5 years. Or, if I look back at 5 years ago versus now, it is getting more and more ahead. As you have to position this as a risk, right? Then, it is like any other risk that you mitigate as a board, as a company, you have to proactively think about it and address it. So as companies are realizing that this can be a real risk, the headlines have certainly helped. I think there is more attention being paid to it. And I think that awareness needs to be raised on, how this can be a risk and how to address it. It's not just about the hype about the negative headlines. It's also about, where NASSCOM has such a huge role that you're playing wonderfully is, coming up with those best practices.
No, I know we are out of time, but I'm still going to ask you the last question, Beena, which is really about what is your advice for India, right? If there were 3 or 4 things that we must put on a fast track, right, for making, to make AI real in India, how do you balance trustworthy AI and making AI real for enablement, inclusion, access, all of that. What do you think should be 1 to 3 that we should focus on?
A few things. One is, when we think about AI, we're thinking about mostly the digitally native industries or sectors. But we have a wealth in agriculture, and education. Those are sectors that I don't think we've seen as much traction in the world of AI and agriculture, for example. Right. So I think there is a huge opportunity to look at legacy sectors, industries, and see how AI can bring the most impact, right, and drive that forward. The other one is, India is at that cusp of where we are now, beginning to scale up, right, and to become that prominent voice to address the negative risk, to think about the negative risk and address it, because we are still early in the journey that you can actually come up with the best practices and take it to the rest of the world. At the third one, I would say is, again, regulations, right? Going to that nuanced level and coming up with the regulations that make sense and not blanket check, banning of technologies, right? I think that's a huge opportunity for India to take the lead.
No, thank you so much, Beena. We definitely build on these comments and recommendations that you've made. And we hope that, next year at this event or any other event, we can host you in person, because, that'll be really good for the audience to hear directly from you and not just on a virtual call. But thank you so much for the time and for your inputs and feedback.
Thank you so much for having me. Take care.
Take care.
Thanks, Beena, for that apt and crisp note on data and AI while dwelling on how to make it trustworthy. Sangeeta, it is always a pleasure to visualize the way you stitch, the conversations in your trademark effervescent manner. Thank you both very much indeed.